Hi, I'm William Malik with Trend Micro. I thank you for joining us today in this discussion about how cybersecurity should apply to protecting and preserving the integrity of your hospital and healthcare environment. In the course of this presentation, we're going to be discussing ransomware attacks, recent security incidents, how the attacks happen, what you can do to prevent them, the major challenges with the solutions, and a way to get past those challenges. Over the past few years, we've seen a number of high-profile ransomware incidents. In 2019, a facility here in the US was hit, and they were unable to access patient records, and the staff could not even monitor fetal heartbeats because of impact of the ransomware attack on critical systems. Last year, in Australia, a ransomware attack caused several surgical procedures to be delayed until it could be cleared up. In May of last year in Ireland, a substantial ransomware attack disrupted healthcare for months and extremely expensive to remediate. And also last year, a hospital in Japan lost access to 85,000 patient medical records. Operations were impacted for a couple of months. So ransomware is a significant problem, and it is not going away. In fact, it is getting worse. This is data for the last 2 years from the US Department of Health and Human Services about incidents in the States. Nearly 4/5 of them were caused by IT and hacking incidents. This would be the ransomware category. And as you see, the numbers are trending upwards rather significantly. It has gotten so bad that we recently had a federal joint cybersecurity advisory focused on healthcare and public health sector activities. The volume of action is going up because the bad guys recognize that healthcare is a critical facility and that they must pay even if they don't have the resources. And so they will find the money somehow. And this indicates the shift in ransomware historically. Going back a number of years, ransomware was just another nuisance. The would-be criminals would just mail phishing emails to everybody and take every target they could. The problem with that kind of, if you will, mass market approach is you have no idea about how deep the pockets are of your victim, and so you end up, hijacking grandma's photographs of the grandchildren, and for $100 she can get it back. But that's no way to make a real business. And so the more sophisticated cyber criminals created more sophisticated and complex attacks taking place over time in the form of advanced persistent threats using Cobalt Strike, Meterpreter, in order to really get into systems and identify critical resources and not only block access to them, but also take copies of the data offsite and hold that for ransom as well. So you had double extortion. You had to pay money to get access back to your systems, and you also had to pay money to keep the hackers from distributing that sensitive information, the personal health data, patient records, financial information. And that transition occurred about 2-3 years ago. And as a result, these targets are much more sophisticated. They're taking a look at who to go after, and they're being very precise about it. And here's what we're seeing. Here's how a ransomware attack happens. There are usually 3 mechanisms for the initial access. The first is to take advantage of a compromised account. There are actually organizations now that will simply do mass scans, dictionary-style password attacks, and record those systems where they were able to get access. They're able to log in, they say, aha, and they put that on their little list. So a ransomware actor can then purchase a list of compromised accounts and filter it against a preferred set of targets. The second way they go after this is spear phishing, and that's a very sophisticated kind of phishing attack where you know your target ahead of time, you understand something about them, and you craft an email that makes it look very, very likely that it comes from a trusted or legitimate source. In fact, just last week, we had an advisory here in the States about a global attack against healthcare facilities, which uses a fake Evernote site So you get an email requesting patient review or from a apparently reputable organization. You go to the phony Evernote site, click on the link, and in addition to beginning the process, you also end up getting some malware downloaded onto your system. The third way that ransomware attacks happen is through the exploitation of vulnerabilities. Now, despite the noise you may hear in the press, 99.9% of these attacks are not using 0 days. 0 days are expensive to get your hands on, and the number of organizations that have known exploited vulnerabilities that are still unpatched in their systems is large enough. The ransomware attackers can simply go after those. They don't need to buy a 0 day. Once they're on board, then they will move laterally across the organization. Why? Because they want to find critical data. They want to identify all the systems that they can shut down. They want to know where you keep your backups so they can corrupt those as well. They want to know where various medical and financial records are so they can offload those. And that gets into the third stage, the data exfiltration, where they're going to go into your systems, they're going to take this sensitive data, they're going to keep it offline, and then they are going to corrupt your copy of it. And then finally, they deploy the ransomware and launch the attack. And so you see, the bad guys have to do a number of things in order to get in. There's a commonplace in information security circles that, the good guys have to do everything right. The bad guys only have to get one thing right. I hope this chart helps you see that the bad guys, in fact, have to get a number of things right. And if you can disrupt this, I believe, called the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin, if you can disrupt this series of activities at any point, you thwart the ransomware attack. And that's the key to how to go about protecting yourself against them. Here are recommendations from the CISA. There are a couple of references at the bottom. In order to prevent the damage or minimize the impact of a ransomware attack, step one, of course, is preparation. If they can't do anything, then you have no worries to mess up. And the way you keep them from being able to do anything is you understand your environment. Do you have a current network diagram, including not only technology you own and run, but also technology you're leasing, technology you're contractually obliged to use, such as SaaS-type applications or cloud-based applications, applications that are brought to you by your suppliers or that you provide for your customers or other third-party organizations. You want to know what accounts have access to these. If a supplier has to dismiss an employee, how rapidly do they tell you? That should be part of your agreement with a supplier. If somebody who has access to your systems on behalf of a third party is suddenly let go, is it going to be that day, that hour, that week, the end of the quarter? I mean, how much longer will that discredited individual still have authorization into your systems? You want to take advantage of what known vulnerabilities you might have. Now, how would you do that? Well, it turns out the CISA runs a list of known exploited vulnerabilities, KEV, and you can go to that list. You can say, okay, this vulnerability in this particular product requires this level of patch. And you can take a look at that against your list of software assets and say, we have this system. Is it at one of the vulnerable levels or not? If it is, then you ask yourself, well, can I tolerate that risk? If something goes wrong there, how bad could it get? How far could the impact be if that system is compromised? What other systems are intimately connected with it? Is it segmented? Is it in its own zone? Or will somebody who gets there have access to all of my core systems? Resolve those vulnerabilities. I mean, certainly patching is one thing. And I'm not going to just stand here and say, you got to patch everything. If you have 1,000 products in your sophisticated IT environment, then you're going to be getting hundreds of patches every month. You're obviously not going to be able to put all of them on as soon as they arrive. First of all, you probably want to go through some QA. Secondly, you want to go through some triage. Is this critical? Do I need to fix this right away? Is there a workaround? Can I disable some functionality and keep running with this system? You want to make sure that your configurations are properly set. And this sounds, again, like a commonplace, but the fact is that with maybe 5 exceptions, every breach of cloud data was a result of a misconfigured system. In only a handful of cases over the past few years has it actually been the fault of the cloud provider that somebody could get into your information. And that's not because your people are weak or incompetent. It's because it is really, really hard. There are hundreds of settings that have to be correctly arranged in order to put a secure function onto the internet. When you create a cloud instance, it's perfectly secure. You're the only one who can see it. You're the only one who knows it exists. But as it goes through the process of development and extension and enhancement, goes through your integration and ultimate deployment, many, many individuals will alter those settings to make it testable, to make it useful for third parties. And if any one of those settings is wrong, then the data on it could be exposed. Fortunately, there are tools that can help you resolve that. They will take a look at that and say, given this set of criteria, these settings may or may not be consistent with what we would consider a safe, secure, and trustworthy operational environment. You want to understand the dependencies internally and with third parties. Understand your network relations with supply chain vendors and with your customers downstream. Take backups, but remember what I said in the previous chart. The bad guys are going to try to find them and wreck them. So take backups and store backup copies offline, disconnected systems. Check them regularly to see if, in fact, they are readable, and make sure they are when you put them back safely away. And finally, have an incident response plan. What to do if this red bell goes off? What are the steps? Who are the critical people? Do they have backup? How do you get back to the restoration of a normal operating environment? Don't just write it down, test it, check it out. And remember that when you run a test, the goal is not to get 100%, no difficulty found. The goal is to diagnose any potential drawbacks. If you go to a doctor and get a test, the fact they didn't find anything isn't good news. The purpose of the test is to find out what's wrong. So run the test with an eye towards not patting yourself on the back, with an eye towards, would this in fact cover all eventualities? Once you've gone through all that, you're pretty well protected. If somehow a bad guy gets in, the next 3 steps in the process come into play. You have to be instrumented well enough to be able to detect it and detect it early. The longer you go unaware of it, the more damage the bad guys can do. You want to know what's going on where, and that means instrumentation, it means telemetry, it means network segmentation. It means bringing together the alerts, the telemetry, the messages, the error warnings into a consolidated platform that will allow you to have continuing visibility of what's going on in your environment. Once you've identified a problem, you want to make sure you understand its scope. You want to be able to contain it. Again, having network segmentation in place means you can fairly efficiently isolate defective or damaged systems, that you can narrow the scope of an attack, and then you can proceed to get rid of it. And then finally, once you're through the event, you want to make sure you can recover the environment properly, and you want to make sure that you document what it is that happened. You want to be able to provide information for forensic analysis, go after and get the bad guys, lock them down. We're getting good at that. So how do you structure your spending? Well, over time, once an incident happens, the costs accumulate rapidly. Against that, the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So you prepare, you test, you check out your systems, maybe, do some sort of a penetration test, not again as a way to validate it, and don't misread the consequences. If a penetration tester says, I was able to break into your kitchen and take every can of tuna fish out of the 3rd shelf next to the sink, well, the solution to that is not to move the tuna fish into the 2nd shelf, nor is it to put a lock on that cabinet cupboard. You need to be able to understand the meaning of a penetration test that reveals an incident, and use that to inform how you will go about protecting the environment. The fact they got here doesn't mean the problem is here. The fact they got here means there's a larger problem, and that's the one you want to block. But the incident happened, and now your operational performance has collapsed. You're not providing service, you're not making money, you're not delivering new products, you're not able to handle customer requests or whatever. And during that period, you want to go through and detect it and figure out what it is you're going to do in response as quickly as possible. That's how you contain the incident. And then finally, once you've narrowed it down and shut it down, then you begin the process of recovery. What we've seen is the cost of a disruption increases over time. It costs a lot less to respond to an incident before the incident happens. That's the prevention phase. You want to prevent where you can and detect and respond rapidly elsewhere. So, what are the challenges to doing this? They fall into three categories. First, you want to take a consistent cybersecurity posture across your IT and operational technology across the facility. Second, you want to be able to keep an eye on and maintain awareness of your evolving attack surface. And finally, you want to integrate effective and efficient cybersecurity operations across the entire span of your combined IT and OT platforms. So how do we do that? Well, maintaining consistent cybersecurity means being aware of everything that is going on there, app servers, file servers, hospital information systems, what's in common infrastructure, what's local, what's remote, what's internet-based, what circumstances allow an individual to bring their own technology on board, their own platforms, their own devices. How smart are the apps on your employees and business partners and permitted doctors and pharmaceutical firms? How smart are their apps with regard to getting information from your systems? Collectively, this is your attack surface. It's the devices, endpoints, servers, network technology, apps, local and remote cloud-based, and the users themselves, both your employees and the contractors and business partners and other firms with whom you interact. And you want to be able to extend that protection across those environments that perhaps can't be protected directly. You may be prohibited from installing technology. You may be unable to patch systems, either because they're complex, the vendor no longer exists, or in the case of hospitals especially, the Federal Drug Administration in the US allows equipment to be used in hospitals once it is passed through a vetting process. And once it's FDA approved, that approval includes the software configuration. So if you apply a patch to a piece of medical technology, then you have just lost your FDA certification, which means that uncertified devices are illegal, not allowed, which means that the certification process, which currently can take 5 years or more, guarantees that the software that you're running in your hospital was last checked in 2017. So what do? Well, you have to protect it. You have to fence it. You have to put you segment your network. You have to put firewalls around things. Where you can, you physically isolate stuff. And you need to include that air-gapped stuff in your attack surface. How do you maintain it? How do you protect it? How do you get information out of it? What technologies do you have to limit the flow of data to and from these systems that are inherently vulnerable and unpatchable? And in order to do that, you need to be aware of your attack surface. The second point, tracking your evolving attack surface. In hospitals, there is fairly significant staff turnover, and as a result, many of your users will not have been through multiple iterations of your cybersecurity training. You have a cybersecurity training program, of course, and you want to make sure that people take it annually and on hire and at the moment when they take a new job or get a promotion. You want to have them go through a refresher frequently. You want them to be aware of the risks of breach credentials, of sharing passwords. And by the way, the simplest way to solve that is just use multi-factor authentication. It's not that much of a nuisance. You give somebody a device, even if it's just their cell phone, an SMS message, a text to grant a second method of authentication is an enormously powerful tool as compared with a static fixed password, which can be written down or shared or guessed. Second, you want to take a look at the attack surface on your devices. Those devices which are unpatched or can't be patched, those devices which are misconfigured, and you can find out that using various tools, static analysis for cloud and so on. You want to make sure you understand what happens when you put new devices into the environment. When you retire old devices, things are better, but how do you make sure that the device is properly wiped and cleaned before it's handed off to a third party? And then finally, what services are you using? What capabilities are there that are not directly under your control? And let's not forget shadow IT. Shadow OT is maybe a new category. Shadow IT, of course, is when somebody brings in a device they're not supposed to have. Shadow OT, similar. We had a hospital in the Northeast in the US where one of the nurses in a long-term care facility, walking rounds 1/3 shift, said, I'm taking care of my aunt at home. Why don't I bring in that same technology that I use at home? I got this pad, I put it under the sheet, and if they move or if there's a change in humidity, then I get an alert and I can go see what's going on. Well, I can get one of those for $60. And so this enterprising nurse brought a few of these in, and for the 20 beds in their ward at $60 a pop, $1,200 capital outlay, all of a sudden, the nurses didn't have to walk rounds regularly. They could rely on the sensor to tell them what was going on. And not only did the nurses become more productive because they could spend time on doing charts, getting medicines ready, intake forms, and so on, but the patients got better care because when something happened, there was a nurse there right away. Not get back to you, it's a 30-minute walk for the rounds, an average of 15 minutes before somebody will come in and check. And so pretty soon, this nurse told other nurses. And before too long, before the end of the year, every bed in this 2,000-bed facility had one of these great pads. Total capital outlay, $60 a pop, 2,000 of them, $120K. Well, you know what? It didn't even pass the threshold of perception because these were purchased on a by-department basis. And then the next year, the head of nursing goes to the head of IT and says, here, can you manage these for us? And the head of IT says, what are you doing? This stuff isn't FDA approved. Shadow OT. The head of IT said, why didn't you just put in a requisition for the smart hospital beds that have the sensors built into them? And the head of nursing said, the smart hospital beds cost $8,000 a piece. And I don't think I'm going to get a $16 million capital appropriation. But for $120K across 15 departments over the course of a year, you never even saw it. And it made my people's lives easier. Yes, but less secure. No secure protocols, no passwords, very primitive authentication, a disaster, and increase in the attack surface. And finally, integrating the operations. If you just bring every alert, every piece of telemetry to a single console, you'll get hundreds of thousands of pieces of information a day. Far too much for any human being to make sense of. Further, the information is going to be siloed and uncoordinated. You're not going to know if this event involving this printer has anything to do with that event involving that insulin pump. What you need is technology that can correlate and analyze and aggregate these alerts. So instead of having tens or hundreds of thousands of incidents, you have a few dozen serious concerns which need to be looked at by a human being. With limited staff, with shortage in people, with the skills problem, with the turnover, and with the increasing complexity of the bad guys' actions, you have to rely on automation. In some cases, that means using a SOC, using an MSP. In other cases, it means taking advantage of a security, a SOAR, in order to respond automatically to the kinds of problems that show up in your environment. Again, the use of artificial intelligence may seem a little bit, futuristic, but I'd make one comment on that, is that an artificial intelligence detective that can find a problem helps you resolve the issue. But think of this in a process maturity perspective. A mature solution should not just find the issue, but the AI should also create the use case, which then goes into the automation technology so that it doesn't rediscover it. In other words, in the future, AI will help, but it'll involve itself with maybe 5 to 10% of the problems. 85 to 90% of the problems will be resolved through automation, which will grow increasingly smart as the AI produces these new use cases to block those things. Don't keep that from your field of perception in future growth enhancements for it. For now, where you use manual operation, you are going to rely on expertise to get those things done. So when it comes to securing the hospital, the goal is to protect personal health information and to sustain critical operations, regardless of what happens. You want to be aware of everything that's going on across the environment. You want to have a combined, comprehensive platform that will pick up not just the latest and greatest new stuff, but will also cover your legacy systems, your unpatchable systems, your isolated systems, that will keep you aware of the risks you're constantly facing and of the particular vulnerabilities that you are in the process of remediating. I hope this is helpful. Thank you for your time and attention. I did mention a number of cases, and I've given here a list of the references that make this up. The CISA documents are helpful. The MITRE ATT&CK framework will give you a broad perspective on how we categorize cyber attacks so that we can identify actors. Thank you for your time and attention.